Let me tell you something that nobody puts in the history books. Cleopatra was not the most beautiful woman in the room. Ancient sources, including people who actually met her, were surprisingly consistent on this point. The Roman historian Plutarch wrote that her beauty was not so remarkable, that it wasn't what stopped men in their tracks. So then what was it? What made Julius Caesar? A man who had conquered half the known world, who had walked through burning cities without flinching, who was surrounded by the most powerful people on earth. What made him drop everything for her? What made Mark Antony throw away his career, his reputation, his marriages, and eventually his life for a woman he had known for less than a week? The answer isn't beauty. The answer is psychology, and it is far more disturbing than you think. To understand Cleopatra, you first have to understand what she was born into. She came into the world in 69 BC as a princess of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Greek bloodline that had ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years. And in that time, her family had perfected one particular tradition above all others. They murdered each other constantly. Brothers killed sisters, mothers poisoned sons, fathers exiled daughters. It wasn't unusual. It was policy. The Ptolemies believed that shared power was weakness, and weakness was death. Cleopatra grew up in a palace where the people most likely to kill you were sitting at your dinner table. Think about what that does to a child's psychology. Psychologists have a term for environments like this. They call them high vigilance developmental contexts. When a child grows up surrounded by genuine threat, not imagined, not occasional, but constant and real, their brain rewires itself. They become extraordinarily attuned to other people's emotions, motivations, and intentions. They learn to read a room before they fully entered it. They become, in a word, dangerous. Cleopatra didn't just survive that environment, she graduated from it. By the time she was 18, she was already doing something no ruler in her dynasty had ever bothered to do. She was learning Egyptian. Her ancestors had ruled Egypt for 3 centuries without speaking a single word of the local language. They conducted court in Greek. They spoke to their subjects through translators. They were, in the most fundamental sense, strangers in the country they owned. Cleopatra found this insane. She didn't just learn Egyptian. She learned 9 languages total, including Ethiopian, Hebrew, Arabic, and later Latin. She didn't do this because she loved languages. She did it because she understood something that most rulers never figure out. Power isn't just military. Power isn't just money. The deepest form of power is making people feel seen. When Cleopatra walked into a temple and addressed the priests in their own language, in their own dialect, wearing their goddess's crown, something happened in those men's brains that no amount of gold could replicate. They felt chosen. They felt that this queen, unlike every queen before her, was one of them. She wasn't. She was performing, but the performance was so precise, so total, that it didn't matter. This is what psychologists call high-level impression management. The ability to construct a version of yourself so perfectly tailored to your audience that it bypasses their rational mind entirely and speaks directly to their emotional core. Cleopatra didn't have one self. She had many, and she deployed them with the precision of a surgeon. Now here is where her psychology gets genuinely dark. When her father died and left the throne jointly to her and her younger brother, a 10-year-old boy named Ptolemy XIII, Cleopatra made her first major mistake. She underestimated the people around him. Within 2 years, her brother's advisors had outmaneuvered her politically. They turned the army against her. They had her exiled into the desert, stripped of her title, her palace, her power. Just another dispossessed royal waiting to die in the sand. Most people in that situation would have accepted it. The odds were impossible. She had no army, no allies, no leverage. Rome, the only power that could have helped her, was in the middle of its own civil war and had no interest in Egyptian politics. Cleopatra looked at those odds and decided they were irrelevant. She raised a mercenary army in Syria. She marched it to the Egyptian border. And then she waited, not with desperation, but with patience, for the right moment. That moment came in the form of Julius Caesar. Caesar arrived in Alexandria in 48 BC, chasing his rival Pompey, who had just been murdered on Egyptian soil. He was furious, politically exposed, and in desperate need of a stable Egypt to secure his supply lines. Cleopatra grasped all of this immediately. But she had a problem. Her brother's forces controlled Alexandria. If she tried to enter the city, she would be arrested, or worse, before she got anywhere near Caesar. So she did something that, when you really think about it, reveals the full depth of her psychological architecture. She had herself wrapped in a linen sack, some sources say a carpet, and smuggled through enemy lines, past armed guards, through the palace corridors, and delivered directly into Caesar's private chamber, alone, at night, unannounced. Now stop and think about what it takes to do that. Not just the physical courage, though that is extraordinary. Think about the psychological calculation behind it. She knew Caesar was vain. He needed to feel like the most powerful person in any room. So she put herself completely at his mercy, physically helpless, as an act of absolute trust. She knew he was brilliant. So she needed her entrance to be something that a brilliant man would find impossible to stop thinking about. She knew he was a showman. So she gave him a story he could tell for the rest of his life. She wasn't just smuggled into that room. She engineered that moment down to the last detail. And it worked. Within 24 hours, Caesar had taken her side. Within a week, he was at war with her brother on her behalf. Within a month, Ptolemy XIII was dead, drowned in the Nile while fleeing the battle. Cleopatra was back on the throne. She had gone from exile with nothing to Queen of Egypt in under 2 months. Now here is the psychological question that historians rarely ask. What did Caesar actually feel for her? Because this is where Cleopatra's darkest gift comes into focus. She had a rare and almost clinical ability to identify what a person was missing. Not what they wanted, not what they said they wanted, but the deeper hunger underneath, the thing they couldn't admit to themselves. Caesar was 52 years old. He had spent his entire life in pursuit of power and had achieved more of it than almost any human being in history. And somewhere underneath that, psychologists would recognize this pattern immediately, was a man who was profoundly existentially bored. Not bored in a trivial sense. Bored in the way that only people who have achieved everything they set out to achieve can be bored. The goals were gone. The hunger had nothing left to eat. Cleopatra gave him a new goal. She didn't seduce him with beauty. She seduced him with scale, with the vision of something bigger than what he already had, an alliance between Rome and Egypt. A child, their son, Caesarion, who could inherit both empires. A legacy that would outlast anything he had built alone. She didn't offer him love. She offered him immortality, and he couldn't resist it. Caesar was assassinated in 44 BC. 23 stab wounds on the floor of the Roman Senate. And Cleopatra, who had been living in Rome, who watched the city descend into chaos, who had a young son with the dead man's name, made a decision in the hours after his death that tells you everything about her psychology. She didn't grieve, not visibly, not publicly. She calculated. She looked at the power vacuum Caesar had left behind and immediately began mapping it. Who would rise? Who needed what? Where was her leverage? The answer, within months, was Mark Antony. Antony was Caesar's most powerful general and political heir. He was brilliant in battle, magnetic in person, and he had one critical weakness that Cleopatra could see from 1,000 miles away. He needed to be adored, not respected, not feared, adored. There is a meaningful psychological difference. Caesar had needed to feel supreme. Antony needed to feel loved, needed an audience, needed warmth, needed someone who reflected back to him the heroic version of himself he believed in. Cleopatra studied this. And then she built him that mirror. When Antony summoned her to the city of Tarsus to account for her political allegiances, note the word summoned, as though she were a subject, as though she were beneath him, Cleopatra did something that she had perfected by now. She ignored him. The first message went unanswered. Then the second. She let him wait. Let him wonder. Let the silence do its work on his ego. Because she understood that a man like Antony would interpret her absence not as weakness, but as power. Only someone truly untouchable ignores a summons from Rome's most powerful general. By the time she finally appeared, he was already destabilized. And the entrance she made. She came by river on a golden barge with purple sails and silver oars that kept time with the sound of flutes. She reclined beneath a canopy of gold cloth, dressed as Aphrodite, surrounded by boys dressed as cupids and women dressed as sea nymphs. The boat was perfumed so heavily that the scent reached the shore before the vessel did. The entire population of Tarsus walked to the waterfront to watch her arrive. Antony sat alone in the marketplace because his own guards had left their posts to go and see her. She had left the second most powerful man in the known world sitting by himself in an empty square, without having said a single word to him, without having been anywhere near him. That is not seduction. That is psychological warfare. And it was executed with a level of precision that most military strategists never achieve on a battlefield. Antony was never the same after that day. He followed her back to Alexandria. He spent the winter there. He abandoned his duties in Rome. He eventually abandoned his wife, his political allies, and finally his dignity, publicly, humiliatingly, in the service of keeping Cleopatra's favor. The Romans were horrified. They couldn't understand what had happened to him. But if you understand the psychology, it's not mysterious at all. Cleopatra had given Antony the one thing that Rome never could. She didn't treat him as a general or a politician or a piece in someone else's game. She treated him as the hero of his own story. She built a world in Alexandria, in their court, in their private life together, where Mark Antony was exactly who he believed himself to be. That is an extraordinarily sophisticated form of psychological manipulation, because it doesn't feel like manipulation. It feels like love. And that is precisely what makes it so powerful and so dangerous. So what do we actually make of her? If Cleopatra walked into a psychologist's office today, what would they find? The clinical picture is complex, and that complexity is itself revealing. There are clear narcissistic traits: the grandiosity, the absolute refusal to accept powerlessness, the deep, almost pathological need to be at the center of every story. These are present throughout her life in ways that are hard to explain otherwise. There are strong Machiavellian traits: the cold, strategic intelligence, the ability to maintain long games across years and continents, the willingness to form alliances purely for utility and dissolve them the moment they stopped serving her. And there is something that sits uncomfortably between empathy and its absence. Because here is the paradox at the heart of Cleopatra's psychology. She was extraordinarily good at understanding other people's emotional worlds. She could read a person's deepest needs with what appears to have been near-perfect accuracy. But she used that understanding entirely in the service of her own survival and power. Psychologists have a name for this specific combination. They call it dark empathy. The ability to feel, or at least to model, what another person feels, not to connect with them, but to control them. It is, in some ways, more unsettling than the cold absence of empathy entirely, because it looks like warmth. It presents as intimacy, and underneath it is something entirely different. Cleopatra died in 30 BC. She was 39 years old. Rome had finally won. Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and the man who would become Augustus, had defeated Antony's forces. Antony was dead, having fallen on his own sword after receiving false news of Cleopatra's death. News that, by some accounts, she had deliberately spread to test his loyalty. Even at the end, she was running scenarios. When she finally understood that Octavian intended to parade her through Rome, to display her in chains as the ultimate trophy of Roman victory, she made her last decision. She refused. She dressed herself in her finest clothes. She arranged herself on a golden couch, and she died by her own hand, on her own terms, before Rome could take that final act of narrative control away from her. Think about that for a moment. Her entire life had been about controlling the story, controlling how she was seen, how she was remembered, what she meant. And in her final act, with everything gone, with no army and no allies and no leverage, she found one last thing she could control: her ending. History called her a seductress, a temptress, a woman who brought down great men with her beauty. Rome built that story because it was easier than the truth. The truth is that Cleopatra was one of the most psychologically sophisticated operators in recorded human history. She understood power, identity, desire, and human weakness at a level that most people never approach. She used that understanding without sentiment and without apology. Was she a narcissist? Probably. Was she a manipulator? Absolutely. Was she a genius? Without question. The more interesting question, the one that psychology still doesn't have a clean answer to, is whether those three things are as separate as we like to think they are. Because Cleopatra kept Egypt stable and prosperous for 21 years. She was, by most accounts, genuinely loved by her people, and she never lost control of her own story, Not really. Not even in death. 2,000 years later, we're still talking about her. She won. I'm Dark Throne Minds. Every week we go inside the minds of history's most powerful, most dangerous, and most psychologically fascinating figures. Next week, Napoleon Bonaparte. A man so convinced of his own greatness that he reshaped the entire world to match his self-image, and then watched it burn. Subscribe, turn on notifications. The history books left out the best parts. We'll find them.